print, email, Facebook, Twitter. More. Digger remembers Australia's bloodiest battle of Vietnam War 50 years on 50 years ago. Jeff Daly was a 21-year-old soldier digging in for the fight of his life. When the dust had settled, he had survived the bloodiest and most protracted engagement of Australia's decade-long involvement in the Vietnam War, an engagement in which 26 Australians were killed in action and 100 were wounded. The battle over two small patches of ground known as Coral and Balmoral would rage for 25 days, during which the young Lance Corporal would help repel mass charges by the enemy and see one of his best mates killed in a rocket attack. Nearing his 72nd birthday, Mr. Daly has recalled what it was like serving as an infantry rifleman with 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, better known as 3RA by those who wore the army uniform. Mr. Daly described the assaults by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces at the Battle of Fire Support bases Coral and Balmoral as human wave attacks. They just never stopped coming. They would use their fallen as cover, he said. They would pretend that they were dead and just lay there, but at the same time when darkness came they would crawl closer to you and they would blow the wire. Battles lasted more than 3 weeks. The battles in May and June 1968 involved almost 3,000 men, Australia's first brigade-sized operation since World War II. Coral and Balmoral were fixed next to a route used by enemy forces approaching or departing Saigon and nearby Bien Hoa. Mr. Daly's battalion was sent to establish Coral on May 12 as part of Operation Toan Thang, the US-led response to the Communist Second General Offensive, or Mini-Tet. The men immediately began work on the defensive positions, and Mr. Daly remembers digging in under fire. It was just like a gigantic football field. There was a few little shrubs and the jungle further out, he said. The only cover we had was when we dug our own holes. Tanks and artillery fired at point-blank range. The bases were filled with artillery, mortars and armoured vehicles supporting the infantry. Mr. Daly still applauds the actions of an artillery sergeant at Coral when the enemy threatened to overrun the Australians. They had broken through and got to one piece of artillery and they were trying to turn that around to fire on the Australians, but the sergeant had the foresight to remove the firing pin, otherwise who knows what would have happened, he said. Exhausted and at the end of one of the longest weeks of his life, Mr. Daly's unit was sent to establish the Balmoral base on May 24. 4 Centurion tanks arrived to provide fire support. Diggers almost overrun, but we'd hold him at 3:45 a.m. on May 26. Balmoral came under a barrage of mortar, rocket, machine gun and small arms fire, but with the support of tanks and armoured personnel carriers, and artillery fire from nearby Coral, the diggers were able to push back the North Vietnamese attack. Thankfully, for the tanks and APCs that stopped them, Mr. Daly said, the tanks were using Splintex, anti-personnel rounds, and the armoured personnel carriers had .50 caliber and .30 caliber machine guns, and they just raked the place. A lot of people say if it hadn't have been for the armoured, we would have been run over by the enemy, but you ask the infantry and we say no, we'd hold them. We didn't want the tankies to get the glory and the tankies didn't want us to get the glory, so we'll call it a 50-50 split. Close friend killed in rocket attack. The known North Vietnamese and Viet Cong losses around Coral and Balmoral were 276 killed, 9 wounded and 11 captured, but the fatalities were estimated to be much higher, as the enemy was known to carry their dead off the battlefield. Among the Australian fallen was 20-year-old Alan John Cooper, a talented Australian rules player from Adelaide, who was killed by a direct hit from the rocket on May 26. Cooper, or Coop to his mates, was Mr. Daly's second-in-command in their 9-man rifle section. That was a pretty bad day, May 26, 1968, but we all knew the consequences, Mr. Daly said. A.J. Cooper was a really top bloke, everybody liked him, and it was just a shame that it went straight down his hole. The rocket went into his hole and it destroyed him. Anniversary brings back raw emotions. Mr. Cooper was laid to rest with full military honours in Adelaide, one of more than 500 Australians killed in Vietnam. Mr. Daly expects the 50th anniversary of his friend's death to hit him hard. I always remember Coop on the 26th of May, because my birthday is the 27th. He said, I like to have a quiet time with my memories there and usually have a few beers and just think of Coop. He was a good mate. Mr. Daly met Mr. Cooper's two brothers at a reunion in Canberra a few years ago and wrote an emotional letter to his parents, telling them how respected Coop was among the men. I never got a reply back, which I'm grateful for in one way, because you talk about it and it becomes embedded, he said. But I always remember Coop. Many close shaves in year-long tour of duty after Balmoral was closed. 3RA returned to the Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat, but Mr. Daly's tour of duty in Vietnam was not over for several months. Wounded once in action, Mr. Daly had other shrapnel injuries, but the reality of the war only hit home after a near-miss on a later patrol when his unit was ambushed by a machine gun team. "I had shrapnel and bullet holes through my shirt," he said. "Some of my rifle webbing had holes through it and there was a bullet hole through the middle of my hat. I've got to admit when that happened I had a breakdown. I don't know why but I never had a drop of blood on me, but my clothes were just ripped to pieces from the shrapnel and the bullets, but I didn't have any holes in me." Veterans abused on return from war. Mr. Daly, originally from Benalla in Victoria, moved to the gold mining hub of Kalgoorlie-Boulder in Western Australia in 1974, said settling back into civilian life was something he struggled with for decades, admitting he never talked about the war. "I had a lot of problems. I had a lot of mood swings and changes, jobs here, there and everywhere. I wanted to be alone," he said. "I never advertised the fact that I was a Vietnam veteran because when we marched through Adelaide we had eggs, tomato, paint, everything thrown at us. It was better to shut up and try and get on with your life, but that was hard because it's a different life altogether from the life you experience when you're in the army." Battle Honours for Vietnam Veterans 50 years on at a national memorial in Canberra on Sunday. The Chief of Army Lieutenant General Angus Campbell awarded the unit citation for gallantry to 3RA for its actions at Coral and Balmoral. Mr. Daly said it meant a lot to him and his mates. "The whole time you were there you were walking on eggshells," he said. "The slightest little noise you would hit the ground, take cover or you just got used to what was being fired in or out of the base. The whole time from the day we got there to the time we left you were on edge. You didn't trust anybody other than your mate.